Okay, perfect. So now we are recording as of now. So welcome to this last web conference for our course. And I'm going to share my screen with you so that so that we can share some things about assessment tonight. Before I continue, do you have any questions on the activity that we're working on?
Yes, teacher, I had many questions about this rubric. For step ones, I know understands what is the step for high development. For examples, is step tools or step three. Uh, what is you can speak what is the marvelence or synthetic or speak more uh, about this 11 step. You mute.
Sorry, perdón. Te voy a compartir mi pantalla y ahí vamos mirando dónde vamos teniendo las dudas y las preguntas sobre esta actividad que es la que estamos haciendo en este momento, ¿correcto? Esta es, ¿sí?
Okay.
Fase 4.
Yes, sir. Sí, señora.
Ok, entonces, bueno, we have to implement the virtual workshop and the evaluation of language assessment tools based on the established assessment principles. The virtual workshop that we did in the last phase, we now need to implement it, okay? So you need to plan and deliver a 2-day virtual English workshop. You will start by selecting the dates and creating a registration form. You need to choose which dates you are going to work on this virtual English workshop and create an invitation so that your students can register to the workshop, okay? And
Okay.
then you have to design the invitation and you have to share with the learners and also on the forum. En el foro de aprendizaje vas a compartir la invitación y las fechas en que vas a hacer la implementación. Then you have to set up conferencing links. So you have to, take a link from Meet or from Zoom or whatever, or Teams, and invite and send it to your participants, okay? Then you have to conduct the 2 interactive workshop sessions. The workshop needs to be divided into 2 sessions, okay? Then after that, your students need to assess the workshop using your rubric, the one that you worked on the previous task. And finally, you have to complete the self-assessment and gather all the materials, the recordings, the field rubrics, the feedback, and put everything into a zipped file. Everything. On the second part of this phase, you will need to take into consideration the rubric template for assessing language and language test sample. Esos anexos están entonces donde descargamos la rúbrica. Allí dicen, and the second must be on your own previously applied tests. First, you have to create a rubric using template Annex 1, and then you have to fill out the rubric for each test and share it with your tutor. Lo vamos a subir al foro para revisarlo y aprobarlo. Una vez esté aprobado, entonces podemos subirlo a el foro de evaluación. Estas lecturas son necesarias para poder desarrollar y realizar esta actividad. Ahora sí, vamos a seguir estos son los pasos que vamos a seguir, ¿ok? Arriba estábamos hablando generalidades de cómo lo vamos a hacer y aquí están los pasos. ¿Hasta ahí vamos bien?
Sí, sino que es un poco confuso porque arriba como que
Sí, arriba
habla
me dan
muy...
me dan una generalidad y aquí me lo están dando ya más paso a paso, ¿cierto? Entonces, en el primer paso, you will develop your virtual workshop, siguiendo estos pasos que están aquí. Choose the dates, que es exactamente lo mismo que yo ya te expliqué, pero aquí me los están dando uno por uno. Escojo las fechas y las horas donde voy a tener mis 2 sessions. Las 2 sesiones tienen que estar hechas en 2 días seguidos en una misma semana. No pueden ser en semanas separadas, tienen que ser en la misma semana. You are going to create an online form on any platform to register learners for your workshop. You can do it in a Google Forms. Por ejemplo, create a registration form. You have to include in the registration form, you need to include the name, email, phone number, and the English level. Then you have to create an invitation for them to participate in your workshop. Include in the slide the level to which it is addressed. Tú vas a decidir a qué nivel de lengua tú vas a hacer el workshop. So you need to include that on the invitation. And then you have to also write the date and the time, the main topics and the skills to develop. Which topics, what are you going to see, and which are the skills? Speaking, listening, writing, what are the skills that you are going to mainly work on? Then you have to share the invitation with your learners. And then the number of people must be between 10 and 15. Ese es el número, between 10 and 15. You have to share the invitation in the forum. Then you have to create the link for the workshop sessions in Teams and Skype and Zoom, Google Meets. And make sure that you know that the platform and that you can record the sessions. You have to record them. Ahí tienen que estar grabadas. And email the registered students in order to introduce yourself. Invite them to the workshop. Y todo eso lo tengo que hacer antes de empezar. Una vez ya haya hecho los pasos del 1 al 5 para empezar el workshop, una vez ya lo haya hecho, I have to develop the virtual synchronic encounters and then make sure that the sessions are interesting, dynamic, that are engaging, make sure that they are learning, that they are interactive and that the students participate. In the last session, ask the learners to evaluate the workshop and your performance as a pedagogical mediator by using the assessment rubric you designed in the previous phase 3. En la tarea que acabamos de calificar, ustedes desarrollaron unas rúbricas. Una vez terminemos la segunda sesión, que los estudiantes evalúen utilizando esa rúbrica, evaluando el workshop and your performance. Then, after the sessions, evaluate the learner's performance by using the assessment rubric you designed in the previous challenge. One rubric per student. Send the learners their performance feedback in their corresponding rubric and some advice. You have to grade it, send it back to your students, and give them feedback. And finally, you have to self-evaluate your performance by using the rubric you designed. In the previous task, you did 3 different rubrics, one for the workshop, one for the mediator, and one for the student's performance. They need to be filled out, una por estudiante. Prepare a document on the cloud or in a zip folder. All the evidence must be with this challenge, the recordings of the sessions, the assessment rubrics, the evaluation of the workshop, 1 per learner, evaluation of learners, 1 per learner, and the self-evaluation. Todos estos documentos que estoy nombrando aquí los debemos poner juntos en el Drive y enviar el enlace o meterlos en un zip drive, en un zip folder. Listen to the professor. Después de haber hecho eso, vamos a escuchar este video y vamos a mirar los principios de la unidad 3, right? And then after that you've consulted the references, you have to prepare the instrument for evaluation and you have to use the template that you find next to this activity guide as Annex 1. Cuando entramos al Learning Environment, está la guía y también está Anexo 1 y Anexo 2. Vamos a bajar Anexo 1, right? And you have to create the rubric and you have to share the rubric in the forum so that I can validate it. And then you are going to use the test proposed that is annexed next to the activity guide. Regarding the second test, use one designed by you and that you have applied in your language classes. Un examen que ya lo hayas aplicado. Fill out 1 rubric per test and submit them to the evaluation environment. Entonces, ¿qué tengo que entregar? Voy a entregar un documento en Word. This activity is individual. Task 1 that contains all these things. Task 2, the test proposed by you and the 2 assessment rubrics fully filled out, 1 per test. Entonces, vamos a entregar, si todos esos documentos los vamos a subir a un Drive, Task 1, entregamos el enlace, nos aseguramos de que todo esté ahí. Y también tenemos que entregar el test with the 2 assessment rubrics. Okay? Is it clear? Or do you have any more questions?
Si son, digamos, 10 estudiantes, serían 10 rúbricas.
Sí, es una por estudiante. Es la misma rúbrica, pero la tienes que, como tú tienes que evaluarlos independientemente, entonces son 10 evaluaciones.
Bueno, y ellos me evalúan a mí, entonces,
Sí, correcto. Ellos también te evalúan a ti y al workshop que creas para ellos.
pero las 2 sesiones es referente a la que ya diseñé, ¿no? En el paso
Sí,
3.
sí, el workshop que ya está diseñado, correcto.
O sea, toca de ponerlo en práctica. Pero en mi caso que yo es face to face, ¿hay qué? ¿Cómo haría
Pues como tú
para
ves
la
clase
clase?
con ellos, no sé si puedas de pronto agendar separar una sala de sistemas en el colegio donde trabajas para que lo puedan trabajar de esa forma.
Sino que acá, como yo trabajo en una escuela rural,
Ujú,
es zona de difícil acceso, soy profesor unitario
ya,
y, y tengo estudiantes de grado 0 a 5. Y tengo el total de
comprendo.
12 estudiantes, pero de grado 0 tengo uno, de grado segundo tengo, de grado primero tengo 2, de grado tercero tengo cuarto, de grado cuarto
Ujú,
tengo 3, de grado quinto tengo así, hasta completar 12. No tenemos
completo,
celulares, no tenemos
entiendo.
computadores, o sea, lo único es como cátedra que uno les podría.
Entiendo. Entonces tú tienes que hacer las adaptaciones necesarias para poder utilizar el workshop con tus estudiantes o conseguir otra población.
Pues sería que lleven celulares, ¿cierto?
Pues si usted, si ellos pueden llevar celular allá y trabajarlo con celular, lo puede hacer. ¿Usted tiene televisor en su aula?
Sí, sí tenemos
En-
televisor.
Entonces pueden trabajarlo en el celular y en el televisor, alternando, de pronto que lo trabajen en parejas, porque
Ujú.
pues es una situación especial, ¿no? Porque se está en escuela nueva.
Ujú. Tocaría
Entonces
como
tendría,
ir, como grabarme.
sí, exactamente, se tendría que grabar mientras que
Mm.
está haciendo el proceso, se pueden hacer las adaptaciones para que le pueda dar cumplimiento.
Ah, listo.
Bueno. Muy bien. Entonces, now I'm going to share my screen again, and we are going to start with the information that we have for today, which is the web conference with the task that we are going to learn. So we are going to work on the 5 pillars of language assessment. This information is very useful for you right now for this task and also for the following one. So we are going to work with the 5 pillars for language assessment. And here, why do we have these 5 principles? So I need you to think that in our field, assessment is not just about what we test, but how we test and why we test. So when we are testing our students, we need to consider what we want to do with them and how do I want to do it and why am I assessing students. So these 5 principles we need to recall: practicality, reliability, validity, authenticity, and washback. These are essential to keep the standards for designing an effective language assessment class. They help answer these questions that sometimes we have in mind when we are developing a test and when we are creating a test. Then we think about, is this a good test? Is this test going to help my students to reach the learning objectives? And so we are going to talk a little about these particular principles that are included into the references that we need to read and the literature that we need to interiorize. So remember that we will find a balance of these 5 principles as we move into assessment. So hang on a second. So first of all, we are going to talk about practicality. Okay, so in the assessment, is this assessment feasible? I mean, is this assessment doable? Is it going to give me correct results? Is it going to help me check if my students are learning? Because the assessment is basically to check how my students are doing. I know and I understand that we need to grade. We need to grade our students, but that's not the essence. The essence for this will be to make sure they are learning, how this process is moving along. So practicality refers to all these logistical and financial reality of the assessment. Sometimes we have impractical tests because they are too expensive, or maybe they take too long to grade, or they are too complex. So when we think of practicality and we want to implement some type of assessment, we need to think about how practical is it, not only for the school, the teacher, but also for the student. So for example, if we were to have an interview, we want to interview and see how their oral skills are, and we're going to have a 45-minute interview. We're going to take forever. So the more students that we have, the longer it will be. Therefore, this is not very practical. So we need to design correctly these rubrics. These rubrics have to be the guide, and they must be manageable. So when I have numbers of high numbers of students, which sometimes they happen in public schools, in public universities, we have a lot of numbers within the same classroom. So the idea is that we become a little bit more practical and able to manage the time in a better manner. The second pillar that we have here is reliability. Is this test going to give me results that I can trust, that I can depend on? A test is reliable if it always gives consistent results. So if the same student takes the test, he will probably get the same score, right? So we need to be able to maintain reliability. If we have, for example, the IELTS test, or we have the Saber Pro, or the ICFES, one of those standardized tests. If a student takes it twice, he should be able to get around the same score. So it's important that we add criteria, standards, descriptors, so that the judgments are consistent. If I leave it open without having criteria, specific standards, and what I'm looking for on the descriptors, and I just leave it open, I won't be able to have a reliability in my testing. So this assessment pillar, reliability, makes the test trustworthy, so that when we use this test, or when we use this particular way to assess, we know for sure that we will get the result closest to the student's competence. The next pillar that we are talking, that we are going to encounter here, is the validity pillar. This has to do with accuracy. Is it accurate? Does it measure what it means to measure? Because sometimes I am doing a writing test and it ends up being only reading, or I'm doing a speaking test and it ends up being grammar. So does this test really measures what it's supposed to? So the most important principle that we have is validity, because a test is invalid if it doesn't measure the skill that it's supposed to measure. Even if the test is reliable, even if I look at the test and I see that the test I can depend on because it has clear criteria, it has clear standards, well-organized descriptors, is reliable, but it is not valid because I cannot evaluate, I cannot test a student's speaking fluency with a multiple choice test, for example. Or I cannot evaluate or test my student's ability to write if he only tells me a story. So what is this test really meant for? So that is validity. The validity needs to measure what is supposed to measure. So this assessment criteria must focus on what is most relevant to the learning outcome. So what is most relevant to the learning outcome, that is right there what the criteria needs to be. So if the learning outcome takes me towards listening, then the assessment must be about specifically listening. I have to be very explicit with this. And so if the learning outcome says that my student will be able to tell short narratives using common adjectives or whatever, he needs to be able to be tested into that particular area, not something else. If he needs to tell the story, I cannot grade him after taking a writing test because it won't be valid. So make sure that we keep that in mind. Another thing that we need to consider is authenticity. So this authenticity has different definitions, right? And when we talk about authenticity, is this is this assessment from abstract knowledge, like all the things he's supposed to know, or is it meaningful for the student? Can he use what he is learning or what he has learned? Can he use it within this assessment activity? So when we talk about the real world principle, we talk about to be able to communicate within a real environment in meaningful situations. And so when we do authentic assessment, it requires that students perform the tasks as it is, like they could replicate a problem, or they could go ahead and do role plays. So Wiggins in 1990 states that replicas of an analogous to the kinds of problems faced by adult citizens and consumers or professionals in the field. So if we could have the students participate in this authenticity part of the assessment, then we may be able to make sure that they are competent. So this authenticity matters also because there are multiple forms of assessment that reflect student learning, achievement, motivation, and attitudes on instructionally relevant classroom activities. So when we talk about authenticity defined by O'Malley and Valdez, they describe it as these multiple forms of assessment that reflect how the student achieves his learning and if he is motivated, and which is his manner, how is his attitude towards the classroom activities. Is he learning accurately? Is this process moving forward? Mueller in 2003 adds that the students are asked to perform real-world tasks so that they can demonstrate that what they are learning, they can really apply it in real-life situations. So when we talk about the real-world principle, we talk about this, whatever it may be that we are teaching, but in this particular case, we're talking about language. If we are assessing language, the best way to know if my student is competent, if my student is going well in the learning process, the best way to do that is to have him or her perform in real world situations so that he can make sure that he is actually learning something that can help him through his life. Because now we need to try to shift the message that English or any other language is a subject. English is not a subject. English is a tool for life. So when we are assessing, we need to make sure that our students are competent. We need them to communicate, to achieve their learning goals. And assessing by using real world tasks will demonstrate that. But will also give us the opportunity to see if there are some mistakes that need to be corrected. So another thing that I would like to share with you are some examples, right, for this authenticity pillar. So in traditional assessment, we focus on selecting a response. So our focus is to only get the question right. So we need to remember what we have learned. We need to give evidence of what we know. And so it is very constrictive in the sense that the teacher is the one that structures it, and the teacher is the one who gives the questions. And so the student will give the correct answer. The student will be able to stay right there in that position. He cannot go out of this traditional assessment gray area. That's where he will remain, because it's just recall information and provide an answer to prove or to evidence that he actually knows something. Whereas in authentic assessment is not focused on selecting answers, it focuses on performing this task, constructing knowledge. So my student will be able to use metacognitive skills. So when I'm doing authentic assessment, I'm providing him the opportunity to structure his train of thought. An authentic assessment will have my student review his thoughts, review what he already learned, but also he needs to construct new knowledge with everything that he's already learned in the past. So it's an excellent way to have our students do metacognitive learning. We also can have specific examples. So instead of grammar drills, like sometimes those are very common when we are evaluating when we are assessing, when we are assessing in language learning, we do grammar drills. A suggestion from these authors, O'Malley and Valdez Pierce, are oral interviews, story retelling, writing samples, projects, exhibitions, and portfolios. All these with the goal of having the student perform and use his competence to achieve a real goal that is going to help him in his life. Not only, he's not learning only for the moment, the student is not learning only for that particular task because I have a test, so I have to learn this, but rather the student can interiorize what he has learned, use it to create new knowledge, and prove that he is competent. Finally, we have this pillar number 5. And pillar number 5 is called washback. Washback, we can also refer to it as the impact. So how does this test affect teaching? Washback is the effect of the assessment on the teaching and the learning process. So our assessments, or the way that we assess, will teach our students what we value. So if we have negative washback, when we're thinking about a multiple choice final exam, it forces the teachers to teach the test. So if I have to have a multiple choice final exam or a multiple choice test, because I have to have that type of testing, then I have to train my student to be able to take this particular test. Therefore, we are abandoning some other opportunities for learning or for practicing. When we have positive washback, is when we have an authentic portfolio assessment, for example, and we can encourage teachers to integrate reflections and improve continuously throughout the semester. So if we implement a portfolio, it's a wonderful way to assess, but will not only serve as an assessment part of the learning experience, but it will also serve as a growing and a way to do follow-up on my student, and also to self-evaluate. The student will be able to see tangible improvements, so he can compare his task production from the beginning and then at the end how he's producing. So he will be able to compare and have be more motivated in that sense. So how do we balance, practicality and authenticity? So as mediators, we cannot always have everything perfect. It's impossible to be perfect. So we can sometimes aim more towards one principle than others, right? So we will find a balance for our context depending on where we work. Of course, wherever the place that we are at, the assessment has to be tailored to the student's needs. So a student portfolio is highly authentic and it has great washback, but it is highly impractical to grade for 200 students. So we need to make compromises. So if I have a small class, I have a class of 15 students maybe, then maybe I can implement a portfolio, and it will be a wonderful, authentic way to assess. However, if I have a classroom with 50 students, how practical is it for me to sit down and read all this? Because if I give an activity to my students, or if I want to plan and assess my students on something, I have to be able to read their production. Otherwise, we won't know if they are progressing. And how do we balance reliability and validity? When we know that we need to balance this type of assessment, then we start thinking about how can I make this not only practical for me, but for it to be reliable and to be valid. So what do I need to assess is the first thing that I need to think about. How am I going to assess, and why do I want to assess? When we first started, we talked about the how am I going to assess and the why am I going to assess. Those two questions need to start with me before I think about reliability and authenticity and validity. So a multiple choice test can be highly reliable because if the answer is C, is the answer and that's it. Because we have to differentiate objective scoring. But it is completely invalid if I'm going to use it for speaking. So remember that an authentic interview is highly valid. I can do an authentic interview with my students, and I will be measuring exactly in which speaking level they are and whatnot. But it is harder to score. Why is it harder to score? Because I'm a human being, and then I may have subjective thoughts. Even if I have a rubric, I may think like, oh no, but I think this person is doing well. Well, maybe he mispronounced a few words, but not that many. So when I start thinking like that and my subjectivity starts interfering, is when the rubrics become a wonderful tool, because they are precise, they are manageable, and I need to make sure that they become part of this balancing act. Rubrics, they need to be well designed, clearly stating the criteria, the expectations, but also it needs to be practical. So it needs to be precise and manageable to maintain this balancing effect on the assessment processes. So with that, I would like to ask you, which of these 5 principles do you prioritize in your own practices? Give me just 1 second, think about these 2 questions. Okay, so we have here, oh, Sandra Patricia, hello. I'm sorry I hadn't said hello to you. We have, which one of...
Hello, Miss.
Hi. Which one of these is most challenging to implement? What do you think? Having these 5 principles? I want to go back to the principles. We only have 5 minutes for the presentation to be over, the meeting, I'm sorry. Remember that we have practicality, reliability, validity, authenticity, and washback. All of them are very important. I believe that to be able to keep a good balance between them, we need to be practical. We need to be practical because teachers, we don't have that much time. So we need to keep it practical, thinking about how reliable and valid it is for my students, and try to work with authenticity. I know that authenticity is a little bit harder to evaluate because we need rubrics, but rubrics will definitely save us when we need to work on assessment. So I would like to thank you for you guys of being here, for keeping me company tonight. I will upload the recording onto the initial environment, and I will be checking forms this weekend. Hopefully, I will have some advancements and some comments because the forms are not moving that much. I was looking at them. So please, if you are watching this recording, make sure that you get all the information you need for this following activity. And thank you, Ever. Thank you, Sandra. And you have a good night.
Okay, thank you for your suggestion.
Thank
You're
you,
welcome.
Miss.
Take care. You're welcome.
Bye.
Goodbye. I'm going to stop the recording.
Okay, thank you so much.